Right, so let's talk about independence movements in Africa after World War One. Again, similar to India, or just like many of these non-Western countries after World War One, many people in Africa were really upset that they don't receive independence immediately after World War One is over. All right, now one of the reasons why this is actually because during the age of imperialism, you're going to see much more of a Western influence over the upper and middle classes of African society. Many of them actually start sending their children to European schools. And so basically, the African elite is going to start to become much more directly influenced by these ideas of democracy, self-government, right? So the age of imperialism sort of led to that sense of nationalism that now they're basically being denied by their mother countries. Also, what you start to see is that a lot of the members of the educated elite start to work directly for the colonial government. And so, again, they start to get exposed directly to what they see as a really hypocritical nature of Western countries, right? On the one hand, when the African elites send their children to European schools, they start to learn about democratic ideals, right? But then when they go back home and experience Western rule or Western influence over their own countries, they start to realize that that sense of democracy is not something that extends to their own country. So again, they're really, really upset by this. They start to realize that the sense of self-determination was sort of racist, or at the very least just Western in nature. And so what we start to see is that there are going to be these new forms of African nationalism that emerge. One of the most important movements that starts to develop during this point was something called the Negritude movement. And basically, this is sort of like the African version of the Black Pride movement. The idea was, again, rejecting colonial authority, right? You're going to see that the Negritude movement becomes very popular among countries that were previously controlled by, or that at this point were still controlled by France. For example, a major influencer in Senegal and Moldova, Leopold Sedar Senghor, is a poet who starts to write about the beauty and uniqueness of African culture, and he wrote in French, right? So again, you see that there's this that they're using the language of their oppressors to sort of protest their continued colonial status. So we do also see that there's going to be non-African intellectuals that become very excited by the possibility of negritude, as well as another idea that's similar called Pan-Africanism, which again is this very dramatic sense of African nationalism that emerges in the early 20th century. Some really important African American intellectuals that also start to contribute to the negritude and just in general Black nationalist movements or people like W.E.B. Du Bois. We see him over here. He wrote a book in 1906 called The Souls of Black Folk, which basically, is talking about how racism will perpetually try to prevent people of African descent from coming to power despite their intellectual quality, right? So W.E.B. Du Bois was Harvard educated, but he still saw, despite his education, a perpetuation of racism in American society. You also see Marcus Garvey here, who was actually in favor of establishing a country in Africa that was meant just for people of African descent. He actually encouraged American citizens to move there. That was the country of Liberia, which basically becomes sort of a back to Africa location for a lot of African Americans who felt sort of disillusioned by their position in American society. Because remember that African Americans are also sort of being disappointed by what they thought would be a promise of a better life after World War I. Many African American soldiers fought in World War I, experienced more equal treatment when they were in Europe, and then they get home and they continue to experience racism in the Americas, so they start to kind of question whether they really have a place in the United States. All right, so basically what we see is that this sense of nationalism is going to emerge in Africa, but nonetheless, we don't really experience a significant decolonization movement until after World War II. So for the most part, African countries after World War I are still basically going to be subject to colonial rule. In Latin America, we also are experiencing this pushback against self-determination. Now, we call this neocolonialism for the most part, which is essentially it in very much is it's a continuity of colonialism, but much more in an economic fashion. So these countries technically have autonomy in terms of political control, but basically their economy is going to be forever tied to the United States. They're not going to be able to be independent in what they produce, and for the most part they are exporting things directly to the Americas. So it's very difficult for them to sort of diversify their economy because they're so dependent on their relationship with the U.S. So what we see is that it's really common for the U.S. to impose indirect control over Latin American countries, despite the fact that they were technically independent. So there's a longstanding precedent for the way that the United States is interacting with Latin American countries. This dates all the way back to the 1820s with the Monroe Doctrine, which was established when James Monroe was president. It was written out by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. And basically, at this point, this is when the United States is still fairly new, right? It did prove victorious over the British in the War of 1812. And so basically what they're trying to do is to prevent European countries from influencing the affairs of any countries in the Western Hemisphere. Basically what the Monroe Doctrine was trying to do was to say that, you know, the sphere of influence in Latin America is us. It's not you guys, right? So stay out of Latin America. Basically what the Monroe Doctrine did was it allowed the U.S. to assert predominance in the Western Hemisphere. And then in the turn of the 20th century, they add on to the Monroe Doctrine when Teddy Roosevelt was president. And so he adds what's called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which basically meant that if Latin American countries first off had some sort of trouble with European nations, that the U.S. would basically act as the intermediary between the two. So let's say Brazil owed England a whole bunch of money. The Roosevelt Corollary said that, okay, it makes sense that England wants to negotiate with Brazil, but basically the Roosevelt Corollary said that the U.S. would do it on behalf of England, right? So again, they still want to assert the idea that only the U.S. is really going to have influence over Latin America. Okay, so again, the rationale was that U.S. intervention in a Latin American country could prevent intervention by European powers. When William Howard Taft becomes president in 1908, we're going to see that he shifts his foreign policy in Latin America to one that actually is not particularly popular. He advocates something called dollar diplomacy. And what that meant was that he wanted to invest U.S. money rather than U.S. military control. He said money over bullets in Latin America. So basically what he wanted to do was to encourage as much private investment in Latin American countries as possible. He was right in the sense that these countries are very rich in natural resources, things like oil, copper, and even fruits like bananas, for example. So Taft believed that the U.S. companies should exploit this wealth before European countries were able to. So he encourages bankers and foreign investors to invest in Latin America. He actually works to pay off existing Latin American loans from European investors, offers low interest to these Latin American lendees. And the idea was, again, for Latin American countries to become increasingly financially dependent on the United States. Dollar diplomacy meant that within about 5 years, U.S. investments in Latin America increased by more than $2 billion. But dollar diplomacy got a lot of criticism. People called it Yankee imperialism. Again, the idea was that increased U.S. investments in Latin America, again, went against the idea of self-determination. And also what we're going to see is that despite the fact that Taft says that he emphasizes dollars over bullets, there were certainly times when the U.S. Nonetheless did use military means to try to protect its investments abroad. And one of the best examples of that is that the U.S. Sends a bunch of troops into Nicaragua to try to protect its interests there. So again, in some ways it's only dollar diplomacy by name. It still does have a military feature to it. Moving forward to the 1930s, FDR basically ends this sort of interventionist policy in Latin America when he introduces the good neighbor policy. And so at this point, the U.S. was still intervening in Latin America militarily when its economic interests were threatened, right? So you have, for example, U.S. Marines were stationed in several nations, including Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So what FDR does in 1933 is he announces this good neighbor policy, which renounced U.S. armed intervention in Latin America. And so the next year, the U.S. removes troops from Haiti and Nicaragua, and the idea again was to, try to stop this sense of too much imperial control or too much military control over Latin America. Now, just looking at the overall backdrop of the good neighbor policy, this is also happening at the same time that the U.S. is trying to assert neutrality with the growing tensions that are taking place in Europe leading up to World War II. So basically, I think the idea was for the U.S. to appear neutral on all fronts and to, of course, withdraw its influence from Latin America so as to not arouse tension within a European country. The good neighbor policy was fairly short-lived. It ends after World War II is over. And one of the reasons why that is because of Cold War fears. You're going to have a lot of Latin American countries become attracted to the idea of establishing their own communist systems, and you're going to see that U.S. foreign policy is going to do much to try to stop that, including sometimes undermining democratic elections in Latin American countries and instilling military dictators in their place. And another thing that's important is that even during the good neighbor policy, Latin American countries continue to complain that they were too dependent on the United States. So the good neighbor policy was not, exerting absolute neutrality in Latin America. Okay, so we do see that there's going to be some significant resistance to imperialism in Latin American countries. One really important resistance against imperialism was held in Nicaragua. It was led by Augusto Sandino, and what he did was he waged guerrilla war against the Americans. He actually dies in the process, but he dies and becomes a martyr for the Nicaraguan cause. All right, so even after Sandino dies, there are going to be other Nicaraguan revolutionaries. They start to call themselves Sandinistas in his honor, and basically they're going to continue to fight against U.S. military occupation of Nicaragua. And in Mexico, you also have some artistic movements against Yankee imperialism. This artist Diego Rivera, you see his work here on the right. He painted colorful murals that contained a lot of Marxist ideas. You see that this is definitely sort of promoting the interests of the workers. And he becomes very popular with socialists in Mexico and throughout the world. But there were, of course, economic elites in both Mexico and the United States that found his art to be incredibly controversial. So what we see here basically is that there is a continued pushback against U.S. imperialism in Latin America, but we'll see very much when we move forward in the 20th century that the U.S., even though it doesn't directly control Latin America politically, it has a major influence over their economic future. And when we get into the 1960s and 70s, they also are directly influencing their politics by doing everything they can to stop communism from taking hold there. So that is an overview of what's happening in all of these countries after World War I, and that's it for these videos. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.